So, with one single tweet, Elon Musk has once again aligned with the Russians and the Chinese against US interests by supporting an American withdrawal from NATO. Let me be clear, outside of like a dozen or so extremists in Congress, no one in the government thinks that leaving NATO is a good idea. Among the US population, 83% of Democrats and 60% of Republicans not only say we should stay in NATO, but that it is an essential part of the US security apparatus. And they would be right. Up front, the US leaving NATO would make Americans less wealthy and less secure. It would also create a vacuum that rivals like China and Russia would be eager to fill. In the short term, the US leaving NATO would signal the end of the post World War II transatlantic order, inviting assertive moves by authoritarian regimes. Both Moscow and Beijing would see new opportunities, Russia in Europe's east and China basically on the entire global stage. The bottom line, China and Russia would emerge as the big winners at America's expense. In the long term, US global leadership would be severely diminished without the NATO alliance underpinning its influence. NATO has been a cornerstone of the democratic international order, as well as the most powerful and successful alliance in history. The US leaving would undercut other networks of alliances, treaties, and norms that the US has led for decades. China would benefit strategically from this erosion. A divided West means Washington's ability to coordinate global responses would be hampered, allowing Beijing to pursue its interests with less resistance. Some European countries that are less economically secure may feel abandoned and may have to align more with China on certain issues, further diluting America's clout. Overall, the global power dynamics would shift in China's favor. The economic fallout of a U.S. withdrawal from NATO would likewise hurt the United States while bolstering China's economic position. In the short run, the loss of NATO's security blanket would jolt investor confidence in Europe and the U.S. while disrupting transatlantic trade. NATO has long provided a stable environment for commerce and investment, with US Europe trade exceeding $1.3 trillion annually under the alliance's protection. Without that stability, markets could become volatile and transatlantic economic ties would weaken as businesses factor in higher security risks and political uncertainty and pay higher insurance rates on the high seas. A Wilson Center analysis found that U.S. security commitments strongly boost U.S. trade and that reducing those commitments would significantly cut our trade volumes. NATO collectively accounts for over 50% of global military purchases, and as a subset, about 70% of U.S. military exports. Thus, leaving NATO threatens to undermine U.S. prosperity, costing hundreds of billions in trade and GDP over time. Over the long term, non-European U.S.-leaning nations may diversify away from the U.S. Countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, and multiple South American nations may begin deepening economic links with China, which is a trend that would directly empower Beijing's economy at America's expense. Just European NATO countries alone invest over $600 billion annually in US businesses, a capital flow that will likely decrease if transatlantic relations deteriorate. Reducing security commitments like NATO could shrink US trade with Europe by at least 20% and overall by 30% with the entire globe. Diplomatically, the US quitting NATO would be an unnecessary self-inflicted blow, one that China could leverage to its advantage. Almost immediately, Washington's unilateral exit would shatter the trust of NATO allies and raise doubts among partners worldwide. Long-standing friends would question America's reliability and commitment, not just in Europe, but in Asia and beyond. Some Europeans are even arguing now that in order to maintain their strategic autonomy, Europe needs China to possibly counterbalance an untrustworthy United States. Beijing could present itself as an alternative partner in global initiatives, encouraging U.S. allies to cooperate with China on issues like trade, technology, or climate, where U.S. leadership has receded. Over time, this would erode American diplomatic leverage in multilateral institutions. The United States, having alienated its closest allies, would find it harder to build coalitions or attain consensus in forums like the UN, G7, or WTO. Conversely, China would have greater opportunity to increase its influence in global institutions and norm setting. Another example is with transatlantic unity broken, European states might be less inclined to side with the US on contentious votes or sanctions against China or Russia. This would amplify China's diplomatic clout, and China could more easily peel away countries from the US camp on issues ranging from human rights to technology standards. The dissolution of US ties with NATO would have stark military consequences as well, weakening deterrence in both Europe and Asia in ways that favor Chinese and Russian ambitions. In the near term, US absence would severely impact the collective collective defense that has kept adversaries in check in Europe. Without the US nuclear umbrella and American troops stationed in Europe, Russia would be emboldened to test NATO's European members, raising the risk of aggression on the continent. Europe may counter by reigniting a nuclear arms race. Historical cases show that aggressors are more likely to strike when they think alliances are fractured or the US will not respond. A post US NATO Europe could see Vladimir Putin probing or even attacking vulnerable states, calculating that the West lacks the unity to stop him. Moreover, leaving NATO would reduce US military reach. Dozens of American bases in Europe, crucial for projecting power into the Middle East, Africa, and supporting global operations, could be shut down. The US would find it harder to rapidly deploy forces or build coalition efforts like countering ISIS campaigns without the infrastructure that NATO offers. All of this diminishes US global military flexibility, which works to China's advantage because without an alliance to hold focus, America's attention and resources could be splintered between an insecure Europe and a rising challenge in the Pacific. Over the long term, a weakened NATO without the US could see a fundamental shift in the military balance of power in the Indo Pacific in China's favor. The credibility of US security guarantees worldwide would be severely undermined by an abandonment of NATO. Even our staunch allies in the Pacific, such as Japan, South Korea, or Australia, would likely question whether they could count on Washington in the event of a crisis. And with US commitments in doubt, Beijing will become more aggressive towards Taiwan. In essence, China would be emboldened militarily. A divided West means any US led response to Chinese aggression would lack the full weight of a global allied support, making such aggression more tempting. Additionally, Europe's reduced coordination with the US would hamper efforts to impose unified sanctions or military pressure in a conflict scenario with China and Russia, further tilting the scales in their favor. China and Russia would deepen their defensive ties, exploiting the weakened transatlantic league to coordinate pressure on two fronts. So a US exit from NATO would be a strategic windfall for China and Russia and a grave setback for American interests. It would fracture the international order that favors democracies, unsettle the economic and security foundations of the transatlantic region, as well as the Western-aligned Indo-Pacific, while diminishing US influence right as China seeks to expand its own influence. Ultimately, the strategic, economic, diplomatic, and military costs would be devastating to the US, while ushering in multiple victories for China and Russia.